The entire kitchen went silent the moment the delivery van pulled up outside Hargrove & Sons Fine Dining. Not because anything unusual happened, but because everyone inside already knew what was coming. The head chef crossed his arms before the doors even opened. The sous chef whispered something to the pastry lead, and they both looked away. 3 line cooks pretended to be busy with prep work. They had already finished an hour ago. And when the restaurant's general manager, a sharp-shouldered woman named Beverly Hargrove, walked out to the loading dock, with her phone already raised, like she was documenting evidence, the message was clear before a single word was spoken. They expected him to fail. Standing beside a weathered delivery cart stacked with insulated bags, a quiet man in a faded gray jacket wiped his hands on a dish towel tucked into his apron and said nothing. His name was Leonard Pruitt. He was 43 years old, a widower raising his 11-year-old daughter alone, and he had just spent the last 16 hours reconstructing a recipe that Beverly Hargrove's own culinary team had declared permanently lost. Nobody in that kitchen believed he had done it. By the end of that evening, not a single person in that room would be able to explain what they witnessed. If you believe that talent doesn't expire just because life gets hard, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this today, and subscribe to Dignity Tales for more stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Leonard Pruitt spent most of his adult life in kitchens that other people owned. He grew up in Akron, Ohio, the youngest of 4 children in a household where cooking was not a hobby but a survival skill. His mother worked double shifts at a textile plant and left detailed handwritten notes on the refrigerator most evenings, not grocery lists but actual instructions. Soak the beans first. The back burner runs hot. Don't let Danny eat the last of the rice. Leonard learned to read those notes before he learned to read anything else, and somewhere in the process of following them, he discovered something that would quietly shape the rest of his life. He loved the logic of food. The way heat changed everything. The way a handful of ingredients could become something that made people close their eyes without realizing they were doing it. By the time he was 19, he had saved enough money working weekends at a hotel buffet to enroll in a culinary program at a community college in Cleveland. His instructors noticed him immediately, not because he was loud or eager in the way young talent sometimes announces itself, but because of the opposite. Leonard watched. He tasted things twice before commenting. He asked questions that made older students glance at each other, the kind of questions that revealed he had already thought 3 steps ahead of wherever the conversation was. He graduated at the top of his class, took a junior position at a mid-level restaurant in Cincinnati, and within 2 years had quietly redesigned their entire seasonal menu without anyone officially asking him to. The owner noticed. Word spread the way it spreads in culinary circles, not through press releases, but through the specific, admiring way chefs talk about other chefs when they think someone else might be better than them. By 30, Leonard Pruitt was the kind of name that serious food people mentioned carefully. The way you mention something valuable, you don't want anyone else to grab first. Then he met Claire. She was a hospital administrator, practical and funny in equal measure, with an opinion about everything and the patience to actually listen to yours. They married when Leonard was 32. Their daughter Maisie arrived 14 months later. For a few years, Leonard's life ran parallel tracks, the professional one moving steadily upward, the personal one becoming the thing he thought about during every quiet moment in every kitchen. Claire was diagnosed when Maisie was 3. The illness moved faster than anyone expected. Leonard took a leave from his position at a well-regarded restaurant in Pittsburgh, telling his employer he needed a few weeks. The few weeks became months. The months collapsed into each other in the way time does when you are watching someone you love disappear 1 degree at a time. He cooked for Claire constantly. Not because food could fix anything, but because it was the one language he had always spoken fluently. And there were mornings when words failed him entirely, and a bowl of something warm was the only honest thing he could offer. Claire died on a Tuesday in November, 9 days after Maisie's 4th birthday. Leonard did not go back to the restaurant. He tried twice. Both times he stood in the kitchen, surrounded by the sounds and smells he had loved his entire life, and felt nothing but the wrong kind of distance. His instincts were still there, his hands still knew what to do. But the part of him that had always connected craft to purpose, felt severed at the root, and cooking for strangers in a high-pressure kitchen felt, in those early months, like performing a language he no longer believed in. So he stepped back, quietly, without announcement or drama. He took a position driving food deliveries for a regional distribution company, a job that paid enough to cover rent and Maisie's school supplies, and the occasional small thing that made her face change, in the way a child's face changes when something unexpected and good happens. He drove, he delivered, he went home and made dinner. He helped Maisie with homework at the kitchen table, while something simmered on the stove, and on weekends he rebuilt broken appliances their neighbors left by the curb, sometimes trading the fixed ones for groceries. When money was tight, he did not talk about what he used to be. Most people who met Leonard Pruitt during those years assumed he had always been a delivery driver. He never corrected them. The man who once had restaurant owners flying him out to consult on menu development, now loaded insulated bags into a van at 4:30 in the morning, and tried to get home before Maisie's school bus arrived, so he could hand her a lunch he packed himself, because the school lunches, he had decided very early on, were genuinely not acceptable. For 6 years that was his life. It was not unhappy, that matters, and it is easy to misread. Leonard was not a man destroyed by grief who wandered through years of grey fog. He was a man who had chosen to protect something, his daughter, his stability, his capacity to keep showing up. At the cost of another something, he told himself he would get back to eventually. He still cooked at home, with the kind of quiet intensity that made Maisie's friends always want to eat dinner at their apartment. He still read food journals late at night. He still had opinions about technique and sourcing, and the specific dishonesty of menus that promised things their kitchens could not actually deliver. He had just stopped believing any of that belonged to him anymore. The call came on a Wednesday morning in March, while Leonard was loading his van outside the distribution warehouse in Columbus. It was a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman who introduced herself as Patricia Shen, the executive assistant to Beverly Hargrove, owner and founder of Hargrove & Sons Fine Dining. Leonard knew the name. Most people in Ohio's culinary world knew the name. Beverly Hargrove had built one of the most respected restaurant groups in the Midwest over 30 years. The kind of operation that attracted serious diners, and the occasional national publication assessing someone to write something respectful about regional cuisine and the people who still cared about it. Patricia Shen explained the situation quickly, in the way of someone accustomed to not wasting Beverly's time by extension. The flagship restaurant had a problem. 40 years earlier, Beverly's father, a self-taught cook named Harold Hargrove, who built the original restaurant from a converted diner in Dayton, had created a dish that became the cornerstone of the restaurant's identity. A braised short rib preparation, but the description didn't come close to capturing it. Harold had spent years developing the process. A specific dry cure applied 3 days before cooking, a braising liquid built on a reduction he made from scratch each week, a finishing technique that involved temperature changes most professional kitchens considered impractical. The dish had never been written down completely. Harold carried it in his head the way certain people carry things they consider too important to flatten into a document. When Harold died 7 years ago, he left behind fragments, recipe cards with incomplete measurements, notes and margins of cookbooks, some of them contradictory, a single photograph of the dish plated, taken by a food journalist in 1987, before anyone thought in terms of documentation or preservation. Beverly had kept everything in a fireproof box in her office, convinced that between her staff and her own memory of eating the dish as a child, they would eventually be able to reconstruct it. They had not been able to reconstruct it. For 7 years, Beverly's culinary team, accomplished, credentialed, decorated people, had attempted the dish repeatedly. Some versions were good. A few were excellent by any reasonable standard. None of them were right, and Beverly, who had eaten the original hundreds of times, and remembered it with the specific, unforgiving clarity of childhood memory, rejected each attempt with the kind of quiet finality that made her staff increasingly reluctant to try again. The restaurant's 40th anniversary was 6 weeks away. Beverly had decided, privately and then officially, that the dish would return for the occasion or not at all. Her team had tried everything they could think of. Patricia Shen was now making calls. Leonard listened to all of this standing next to his van in a warehouse parking lot in Columbus, one hand on the door handle, morning cold coming through his jacket. When Patricia finished, there was a pause. "Why me?" Leonard asked. Patricia said that Beverly had been making calls to people with specific backgrounds in reconstructive cooking. Work involving historical recipes, discontinued techniques, ingredients sourced from older agricultural traditions. Someone had mentioned Leonard's name. Patricia did not say who. Leonard asked for 24 hours to think about it. He spent most of those 24 hours, telling himself he was going to say no. He sat with Maisie that evening, while she finished a school project about the water cycle, and he looked at her bent over her notebook, with her tongue pressed against her teeth, the way she always concentrated. And he thought about Harold Hargrove's recipe cards, sitting a fireproof box, in a restaurant office, and he thought about the photograph from 1987, and he thought about the braising liquid, and why someone making a reduction from scratch every week would consider that the correct approach, rather than the efficient one. He called Patricia Shen the next morning, and said yes. The first time Leonard walked into the Hargrove and Sons kitchen, the atmosphere was somewhere between a performance review and a police lineup. Beverly Hargrove was already there. She was 68, with the posture of someone who had spent decades standing in professional kitchens, and the expression of someone who had spent decades being disappointed by people who thought they understood things they did not understand. She nodded once when Leonard came in, and handed him a manila folder, containing copies of everything from the fireproof box. The head chef, a man named Collier, who had trained in France, and worked in 3 cities before Beverly recruited him, watched from across the stainless steel prep counter, with his arms crossed. The sous chef stood beside him. 2 other senior cooks were staging nearby, with the specific focused attention of people who are pretending to work while listening to everything. Nobody said anything unkind. They were professionals, but Leonard had spent enough years in kitchens to understand what the silence meant, and what the crossed arms meant, and what it meant when nobody offered to show him where things were kept. He opened the folder. Harold Hargrove's handwriting was cramped, and slanted slightly left. The handwriting of someone who had taught himself to write, and never entirely made peace with the mechanics of it. The recipe cards were warped at the edges from old moisture. Several measurements were written in fractions that didn't correspond to any standard culinary unit Leonard had encountered, which told him immediately that Harold had developed his own shorthand. A private measurement system tied to specific vessels or tools that no longer existed. This was not going to be a substitution problem. It was a translation problem. Leonard spent 3 hours reading. He didn't taste anything. He didn't touch any equipment. He sat at a prep table with the folder open, and a yellow legal pad beside him, and worked through every fragment. Methodically, the way you work through a text in a language you mostly know, picking up cognates, flagging inconsistencies, building a map of what was certain and what was inference. The kitchen moved around him. Orders went out for the dinner service. Collier ran his station, with the controlled precision of someone proving a point. Leonard noticed all of it, and said nothing. What he was seeing in Harold's notes was a dish built around patience, in a way that most modern kitchens had systemically eliminated. The dry cure was applied not to preserve or season in the conventional sense, but to change the cellular structure of the meat over time. A slower process than most contemporary recipes allowed for, requiring a walk-in cold enough, and a timeline long enough, that most kitchens would redesign the approach before they would commit to it. The braising liquid used a combination of aromatics that included 2 things Leonard had to look up. Not because he didn't know them, but because neither was commonly sourced anymore. One was a variety of dried plum, from a specific region, that had largely been replaced by a more commercially viable alternative, with a different sugar profile. The other was a fermented black garlic preparation that Harold appeared to have made himself rather than purchasing. The finishing technique was the strangest part. Harold's notes described what amounted to a controlled temperature drop mid-braise, pulling the vessel, allowing the liquid to cool to a specific range, then returning it. The note beside this step simply said, "Let's it remember." Leonard read that 3 times. He made notes for 2 more hours. Then he found Collier, and asked if he could see the walk-in. Collier walked him back without speaking. Leonard looked at the available space, the temperature controls, the existing inventory. He asked 2 questions about the sourcing protocols. Collier answered both, with the economy of someone doing the minimum required. Leonard went back to the prep table, and wrote for another hour. At 6 o'clock, he told Patricia Shen he would need 4 days, and a specific list of ingredients, some of which would require sourcing outside the restaurant's regular suppliers. He handed her the list. Patricia looked at it carefully. She said she would speak with Beverly. Beverly approved everything by 8 o'clock that evening. What happened over the following 4 days was not dramatic in the way that word usually implies. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was slow and repetitive and deeply, almost stubbornly ordinary, which is sometimes what mastery actually looks from the outside. Leonard came in each morning before the kitchen opened. He worked through the cure process on the first day, calculating the vessel-based measurements Harold had used against standard weights until he had a conversion table he trusted. He sourced the dried plums through a specialty importer in Chicago, who needed 2 days to locate stock. He made the black garlic preparation from scratch, a process that required controlled heat over more than 40 hours, and produced on the second day something that smelled so specifically and unexpectedly right that he stood in front of it for a long moment without moving. He called Maisie from the parking lot that evening. She was staying with his neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Kowalski, who had become something between a grandmother and a co-parent in the years since Claire died, and who never asked Leonard to explain himself, but always managed to say the right thing anyway. "You okay, Dad?" Maisie asked. "Yeah," he said. "I think I found something." "Found what?" He thought about Harold Hargrove, and the note that said "Let's it remember," and the photograph from 1987, and the fireproof box, and the 40 years of people eating something that had mattered to them, for reasons they probably couldn't fully articulate. "Something that was lost," he said. Maisie was quiet for a second, "Like when I lost my library book and it was in my backpack the whole time." "Exactly like that," Leonard said. On the third day, Collier stopped pretending not to watch. It started in the afternoon, during a break between prep and service. Leonard was working through the braising liquid reduction, and the smell that began moving through the kitchen was specific in a way that stopped conversation. Not dramatically. Not the way smells in movies stop people in their tracks. More quietly than that. The way something familiar registers before you've identified what it is, a small internal adjustment that happens below the level of conscious thought. Collier drifted closer. He didn't say anything. He stood at a distance that was technically within normal kitchen traffic, and watched what Leonard was doing with the kind of attention that's harder to fake than indifference. The sous chef came over. Then one of the line cooks. Leonard kept working. On the 4th day, Beverly Hargrove came into the kitchen at 7 in the morning, hours before she normally arrived, and sat on a stool near the far wall without explanation. She wore reading glasses and carried a coffee in a paper cup, and looked like someone who had not slept particularly well. She did not speak to Leonard. He did not speak to her. The temperature drop happened in the afternoon. Leonard pulled the braising vessel, monitored the cooling with a thermometer, watched the liquid settle into the range Harold's notes had specified. The kitchen was quieter than it should have been for that time of day. Several people found reasons to be nearby. When Leonard returned the vessel to heat and the smell changed, shifted into something deeper and more complete, a smell that was not just appetizing, but somehow also old, also memory adjacent, also the specific emotional register of something you didn't know you'd been missing. Beverly Hargrove set down her paper cup. She did not move. She sat very still on the stool near the far wall, and she took off her reading glasses, and Leonard, from across the kitchen, saw her press her fingers against her mouth. He kept working. The finishing took another 2 hours. Plating was something Leonard approached last, returning to the 1987 photograph and making a choice to honor the original presentation rather than update it. This was not his dish, and the right answer was not to make it his. He plated a single portion. He carried it to Beverly Hargrove. The kitchen had gone almost completely silent. Beverly looked at the plate for a long moment without touching it. Then she picked up a fork, cut a piece of the short rib, and put it in her mouth. The room was so quiet that the sounds from the street outside became briefly audible. Beverly chewed slowly. She set the fork down carefully, the way you set something down when you're concentrating on something else. She looked at the plate, she looked at Leonard, she looked at the plate again. Then Beverly Hargrove, who her own staff described as someone who had never cried in a professional setting in 40 years of running a restaurant, put her hand flat on the prep counter and said, in a voice that was completely steady, despite the fact that she was clearly not completely steady, "That's my father's food." Nobody in the kitchen spoke. "That's exactly it," she said. "That is exactly it." Collier, standing 3 feet away with his arms no longer crossed, looked at the plate, looked at Leonard and said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. The room already contained the answer to every question that had been asked, since Leonard Pruitt walked through the door. The 40th anniversary dinner was held on a Saturday evening in late April, inside a dining room that had been quietly and specifically prepared for the occasion. The invitation list included longtime patrons, a few food journalists, several figures from Ohio's culinary world, and 3 tables of ordinary customers who had won spots through a reservation lottery. Beverly's team had quietly run through the restaurant's mailing list, because Beverly had decided, against the advice of her publicist and her marketing director and her eldest son, that the night should include people who just loved the restaurant, not only people who could do something for it. There was no formal announcement about what had happened in the kitchen. The menu simply listed the dish under Harold Hargrove's name, the way it had appeared on menus 40 years earlier, with a note beneath it that said restored. April 2025. Leonard sat in the back of the room near the kitchen pass. He was not scheduled to be there. He had delivered the recipe documentation that morning, and assumed his involvement was complete. But Beverly had called him personally and asked him to come. And when Beverly Hargrove asked you personally for something, declining required a specific kind of conviction Leonard didn't have in him that day. Maisie sat beside him, wearing a navy dress she had picked out herself and shoes she had already complained about twice during the car ride over. She looked at everything with the specific wide-eyed attention of a child who understands that something important is happening without quite knowing what it is. "Why does everything smell so good?" she asked. "Because someone worked very hard for a very long time to make it that way," Leonard told her. "You, me, and someone who came before me." When the dish went out to the tables, 40 portions, one for each year of the restaurant's existence, plated with the same simplicity Harold had used in 1987, the dining room went through a shift that Leonard had never seen happen at that scale. Not everyone received it the same way. Some tables tasted it and talked about it immediately, the way people talk about good food. Other tables went quiet. An older couple near the window, both of them longtime regulars who had known Harold personally, held hands across the table. A woman at the third table pressed her napkin to her face and turned toward the window for a moment. And the man beside her put his hand on her back, and neither of them said anything. Because there was nothing to say that the food hadn't already said. Beverly stood at the front of the room and addressed the guests briefly. She was not, by nature, a public speaker, and she did not pretend to be one. She said that the restaurant existed because of the man whose name was on the menu tonight. She said that the dish they had just eaten had been lost for 7 years, and had now been brought back by someone who understood that cooking is, at its foundation, an act of translation. Taking something that exists in one moment and making it available in another. Then she said Leonard's name. She said he had not only recovered the dish, but had documented the full process for the first time in the restaurant's history, producing a record that would allow the recipe to be reproduced accurately, without depending on any single person's memory. She said she had asked him to head a new role at the restaurant, a position she was calling the Historical Kitchen Project, with the mandate to identify and restore other dishes from the restaurant's 40 years that had been partially or fully lost, a position with full creative authority, and a title that Leonard had spent some time arguing against, because he felt the official version was too formal, and Beverly had overridden him, because she felt his instincts were good, but his relationship with receiving credit was genuinely problematic. Leonard did not stand up. He did not make a speech. He looked at his plate, and then at Maisie, and then at the room, and after a moment he raised one hand in a brief acknowledgement that made several people laugh softly. Because it was such an extremely Leonard Pruitt response to having a room full of people look at you. Maisie leaned over and said, very quietly, "Dad, you have to stand up." "I'm standing up on the inside," he said. "That's not how standing up works." He stood up. The room was warm, and the applause lasted longer than he was comfortable with, and Collier, who had spent the weeks following that fourth day becoming, if not exactly a friend, something significantly better than an adversary, caught his eye from across the room, and gave him a single nod of the kind that doesn't require any interpretation. Later that evening, after the guests had gone, and the kitchen staff were breaking down the service, and Maisie had fallen asleep in the back corner booth, with her navy dress slightly rumpled, and her uncomfortable shoes finally off, Leonard sat at the pass with a cup of coffee, and the folder containing Harold Hargrove's original recipe cards. He had made copies. The originals were going back in Beverly's fireproof box, where they belonged. But he held the folder now, and thought about the specific kind of survival that involves showing up for something smaller than the thing you used to be, and doing it honestly. And trusting that the larger version of yourself isn't gone, but only waiting for the right conditions to become useful again. He thought about Claire, the way he always thought about Claire when something happened that she would have had strong opinions about. She would have told him he should have said yes faster. She would have made fun of him for arguing about the job title. She would have taken approximately 17 photographs of Maisie asleep in the booth. He thought about Harold Hargrove, dead 7 years. His handwriting still cramped and left slanting on warped recipe cards, his shorthand, still decipherable, if you were willing to sit with it long enough. The dish was back in the world now. The thing Harold had made with his hands and his memory, and his specific, unrepeatable understanding of what food could do. It was back. Not because the loss had been reversed. Loss doesn't reverse. But because someone had sat down with what remained, and taken it seriously, and treated it as worth the effort of understanding, and refused to flatten it into something more convenient. Leonard finished his coffee. He listened to the kitchen sounds winding down. He looked at Maisie across the room, her cheek against her folded arms, breathing slowly. Sometimes the things we think are gone are only waiting for someone patient enough to look for them in the right place. He picked up the folder, turned off the light above the pass, and went to wake his daughter.